Nobody in Coburn Valley, Oregon could quite understand why 76-year-old Silas Meyer walked his vineyard alone every single night that spring, long after dark, moving slowly between the rows with one hand trailing along the trellis wire and the other resting lightly on each vine as he passed. Silas had lost his sight completely 6 years earlier, a slow decline from glaucoma that no surgery had managed to stop, and most of Coburn Valley assumed the nightly walks were simply something a lonely, stubborn old man did to feel connected to land he could no longer see. His granddaughter, Talia, 17 and living with him since her own parents' accident 4 years earlier, worried about it more than she let on. She'd offered, more than once, to walk with him, and Silas had always declined, gently but firmly, telling her the vineyard needed exactly one set of hands out there at that hour, and hers weren't it yet. She never fully understood what he meant by that until the second week of April, when a hard, unseasonable frost swept down through the valley overnight and destroyed a season's worth of new grape growth on farm after farm, everywhere except the one vineyard whose owner had walked out into the dark 3 hours earlier and told his granddaughter, with complete certainty, to wake every neighbor she could reach. If stories about quiet resilience, inherited skill, and the surprising ways people adapt to loss matter to you, this is exactly the kind of story we tell every week. Go ahead and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if this story moves you, tap that like button before you go. It genuinely helps this small channel find the people who care about stories like Silas's. Now let's find out what those nightly walks were really telling him, and why an entire valley would end up needing to trust a blind man's instincts. Coburn Valley sits in Oregon's wine country, cool hills folded with vineyard rows that had turned the region, over 3 decades, into one of the state's more respected Pinot Noir producing areas. Silas had planted his own 18 acres in the early 1990s, building the operation up slowly alongside his late wife, Greta, who'd passed away 9 years before the story, and running it largely on his own in the years since, adapting his methods gradually as his eyesight declined and eventually disappeared entirely. He hadn't given up the vineyard when he lost his sight, though most of Coburn Valley had quietly expected him to. He'd simply relearned it, walking the rows for months after his diagnosis with his hands doing the work his eyes no longer could, memorizing the exact spacing between vines, the particular lean of certain trellis posts, the sound the gravel made underfoot in different sections of the property. Talia had come to live with him not long after that relearning period, and had watched, over 4 years, her grandfather build an entirely different relationship with the land than the one he'd had when he could see it. What Talia hadn't fully understood, not until that April, was how much of what Silas was doing on those nightly walks amounted to a kind of weather reading most sighted growers never developed, because they'd never needed to rely on anything except a glance at the sky or a check of the forecast on their phones. Silas had lost that option entirely, and in losing it had built something else in its place almost without meaning to. It started, as Silas explained it much later, with simple necessity. In his first spring without sight, worried about frost damage to young buds without being able to see the sky for warning signs, he'd begun walking the rows after dark, running his fingers lightly along leaf surfaces to check for the first signs of dew forming, since dew formation on a clear, calm night was often an early indicator that conditions were right for a hard radiative frost later before dawn. He'd learned to feel the difference between a still, frost-prone night and a breezy one that would likely stay safely above freezing, since even light, steady wind mixed the air near the ground enough to prevent the sharp temperature drop that caused frost damage. He'd learned, too, to notice the particular cold, heavy scent of air pooling in the vineyard's lower rows on certain nights, cold air being denser than warm air and prone to draining downhill and settling in low pockets, exactly the kind of frost-prone microclimate that instruments confirmed decades later, but that farmers had understood instinctively for generations before thermometers existed at all. None of this had struck Silas as anything unusual. He'd simply been solving a practical problem the only way available to him. But over 6 years of nightly practice, that problem-solving had sharpened into something considerably more precise than most sighted growers in Coburn Valley ever bothered to develop, since they had the luxury of checking a forecast instead of walking outside to feel the air themselves. Talia had grown up hearing her grandfather talk about frost risk in terms she found slightly mystifying. The air feels wrong tonight. Or, the vines are holding moisture too early. She'd assumed, for most of her time living with him, that this was simply old farmer talk, the kind of half-superstitious phrasing older growers used instead of plain numbers. It wasn't until she started paying closer attention, around the start of that particular April, that she began to notice her grandfather was right far more often than random chance would explain. Coburn Valley's growers had watched an unusually mild March give way to a changeable April, warm enough during the day to push grapevines into early bud break across the region. Tender new growth emerging weeks ahead of a typical season, and therefore far more vulnerable than usual to a late frost event if one arrived before the vines had hardened off. The Regional Agricultural Extension Office had issued general frost risk advisories through the first 2 weeks of April, the kind of broad, valley-wide warnings that told growers to stay alert without predicting any specific night with real confidence. Silas's neighbor, Deacon Whitlow, who ran 12 acres just down the county road and had known Silas since long before the blindness, mentioned to another grower at the co-op that week that Silas was still out there every night, walking his rows like clockwork, blind as he is. A comment made with genuine fondness but also the faint, familiar undertone Coburn Valley had settled into over 6 years, affectionate concern mixed with a quiet certainty that the old man's habits were more about coping than actual usefulness. On the night of April 11th, Silas walked out into his vineyard at his usual hour, just after 10, and noticed almost immediately that something felt different from the previous several nights. The air was entirely still, without even the faint, steady breeze that had kept frost risk low through most of the month. When he ran his hand along the first row of vines, the leaves were already damp with forming dew, far earlier in the evening than he'd typically expect. And when he walked down toward the lower southeastern corner of the property, the coldest, lowest-lying section prone to cold air pooling, the temperature drop against his face and hands was sharp enough that he stood still for a long moment, entirely certain of what was coming. He walked back to the house immediately and woke Talia, telling her plainly that a hard frost was coming before dawn, harder than anything the general advisories had suggested, and that she needed to start the vineyard's wind machines immediately and then call every neighbor whose number she had. Talia didn't hesitate, though she admitted afterward that some small part of her wondered, in that first half-asleep minute, whether her grandfather might simply be wrong this time. She started the wind machines, the tall fan-like structures growers used to mix warmer air from higher elevations down into the vineyard's cooler pockets, disrupting the still conditions that allowed frost to form. Then she started calling first Deacon Whitlow, then 3 other growers whose numbers she had from years of her grandfather's community involvement, relaying the warning exactly as Silas had given it to her, specific, urgent, and confident in a way that made more than one groggy grower decide, mostly out of respect for Silas rather than full conviction, to get up and check their own equipment. The frost arrived hard between 2 and 5 that morning, temperatures dropping to 26 degrees across low-lying sections of Coburn Valley, well below the threshold that damaged tender new grape growth. It hit hardest in exactly the kind of low, still pocket Silas had felt forming in his own vineyard hours earlier, and it caught most of the valley almost entirely unprepared, since the general advisory issued days earlier hadn't specified that particular night with anything like the certainty Silas had felt firsthand. Growers who hadn't gotten Talia's call, or who'd gotten it too late to act, lost significant portions of their new growth. One operation on the valley's eastern side reported losing nearly 40% of its bud break entirely, a serious blow this early in the season with real consequences for that year's harvest. Deacon Whitlow, who'd started his own wind machines within 20 minutes of Talia's call, came through the night with only minor, scattered damage, a fraction of what his unprotected neighbors experienced. Silas's own vineyard, running wind machines from well before midnight, suffered almost no damage at all. Deacon came by the following afternoon, walking Silas's healthy, undamaged rows with an expression considerably more serious than the fond, faintly humoring look he'd worn discussing Silas's nightly walks at the co-op the week before. "You knew that was coming hours before the rest of us had any real warning," he said, more statement than question. Silas explained, in the same plain, unhurried way he explained most things, what he'd felt in the vines that night, the early dew, the stillness, the cold pooling low against the ground. Word moved through Coburn Valley quickly after that, the way it does after a hard, costly frost event proves somebody right in a way nobody can easily dismiss. The Regional Extension Office, hearing about Talia's early warning calls through more than one grower's account of that night, reached out to Silas directly the following week, and an agricultural meteorologist named Dr. Farah Nasrallah drove out to interview him about his methods, genuinely curious whether the sensory cues he described correlated with anything measurable. What Dr. Nasrallah found, cross-referencing Silas's account against the valley's limited weather station data from that night, was that his vineyard's lower southeastern corner, the exact section where he'd felt the sharp cold pooling that had convinced him to act, showed the earliest and most severe temperature drop of any monitored location in the valley that night, a full 90 minutes before the extension office's own instruments elsewhere had registered conditions serious enough to justify an urgent warning. Silas, walking that ground with nothing but his hands and years of practiced attention, had effectively outpredicted the region's available monitoring by an hour and a half. By the following spring, 3 neighboring vineyards had installed additional weather monitoring specifically in their own low-lying frost pockets, inspired directly by what Dr. Nasrallah's assessment had revealed about how localized and fast-moving frost risk could be within a single valley. Deacon Whitlow started calling Silas most evenings that following April, not out of pity or habit, but to ask, plainly, what the vines felt like that night. Silas never made much of what happened that April. When people asked how he'd known, he usually gave some version of the same answer. He hadn't known anything with certainty the way an instrument might. He'd simply spent 6 years learning to trust his hands the way he'd once trusted his eyes, and on that particular night, his hands had told him something worth waking the whole valley over. There is a particular kind of expertise that only develops when an easier option disappears entirely, forcing a slower, more careful attention that most people never have reason to build. Silas Meyer hadn't set out to become Coburn Valley's most reliable frost predictor. He'd simply refused to let losing his sight mean losing his vineyard, and in rebuilding patiently and without complaint, an entirely different way of reading the land, he ended up seeing something coming that every sighted grower in the valley, checking their phones instead of their own vines, had missed completely.